How did it get this way? What is the history of this place? Why is this happening? How could it have been abandoned?
It just became a jungle.
You're standing at the side of the road, you're seeing a bus, and there is no driver. And this is exactly what Mount Moriah is.
It's too big to ignore, so we have to do something. How can we work together to do something?
My father advised me not to come because he said it's dangerous, which kind of made me want to come even more.
Mount Moriah was founded in 1855. Mount Moriah Cemetery is one of the early rural garden cemeteries or Victorian garden cemeteries that was part of the wave of interest in a new way of burying and celebrating death. They purchased 50, 60 acres along Cobb's Creek in Philadelphia.
The cemetery started out on this side, on the Philadelphia side, and eventually grew to a reputed 380 acres.
People wouldn't be buried in rows. Instead, they would meander. It's kind of adventurous and kind of mysterious. So you would meander along kind of a winding path, and as you moved along, you found people buried there, and then you would commune with them. And the idea was that they were not really dead. They were simply sleeping. You're bringing them back to life in your mind. And that's the whole point of these kinds of cemeteries. They had a very well-known architect named Stephen Button who designed a Victorian gatehouse, and it's done in the Romantic style, so it looks like a castle.
Like any other cemetery, they tried to get business, so they really kind of focused on the groups that they could sell plots to, like the different religious organizations, different fraternal organizations.
And they would buy a plot, and then that would be for the use of their members. For example, during the Civil War, Philadelphia was a huge center of hospitals. Philadelphia had at one time 24 different military hospitals. And one of them was located close to Mount Moriah. They needed a place to bury the veterans who had passed on. And so a plot was made available on the Philadelphia side. And there are 404 veterans of the Civil War who died in the hospitals of Philadelphia, buried there, and 2 Confederates.
Probably around the 1960s, the owners started to fall on hard times.
The cemetery company went broke.
And a lot of the overgrowth, from what we've been told, started happening around that time. So into the 1970s, it got worse.
People were coming in there and abandoning cars, drug deals, prostitution, wild dogs were loose, crime was going on, dumping.
The owners died off and disappeared. So in 2011, when the cemetery officially closed, there was no owner of record to be found. And as it happened, I think it was 2004 when the last member of the original board died. So there was really no owner since about 2004.
The cemetery company was sued. You aren't taking care of the plots. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You owe so much back taxes or whatever. And they apparently said, well, we can't afford it, we're broke, we're shutting down operations. And they essentially locked the door of the office, walked out, and left.
The cemetery closed, so that changed the dynamics tremendously because now we've got an abandoned cemetery.
People are appalled that such a thing could happen.
A lot of people were very emotional because they didn't know what was going to happen. The cemetery closed. They weren't sure about their loved ones.
At Mount Moriah, I have a daughter who was premature, and she lived for about 30 minutes. And once we found out that Mount Moriah was closing, it affected us greatly. My wife and I, we were very upset by it. So one of the things we tried to do is one, try to make sure we found out exactly where the plot was. And then 2, we tried to figure out exactly what would happen next, you know, how we could find some way to mark over the grave to make sure that it wouldn't become overrun.
our family, the way we've raised our boys, we don't shy away from talking about death. We've had losses in our family, and because we've talked so openly about death, they're used to it. This is a part of life. They realize that. Some people think, why would you ever bring a child to a cemetery? I think children need to know where they come from. I'm happy to bring them along.
It's imperative that we teach future generations about our history.
We had a practice of going there at least once a year, if not more than that a year, to visit the grave. As our kids got older, we wanted to start taking them there. But this issue at Mount Moriah has escalated in the past few years, so to even go there now is more difficult. And this is the stage at which we want her siblings to actually understand the value of going to visit her, to actually understand the value of going to see her grave and praying for her, and not being able to do that, or not being able to maintain that tradition is a bit tough. So now I can safely say that no one in my family is really at peace, and it's not just a matter of how it looks physically or how inaccessible it is. It's also the idea that there's no one there there's no caretaker for it.
I was researching some of my ancestors that lived in Philadelphia, in the Riddell family. On their death certificates, it says Mount Moriah Cemetery. It made me want to learn more.
We have this urge for history. We have this urge to know our stories. Our stories are really interesting. They pose questions about how we're going to conduct our own lives when we find out about our past and our relatives. We like to know who was there before us, who were they, what is their story? Is there something in their story that can nourish our lives and who we are, or that can suggest to us maybe we should live a different story?
There's lots of Riddell family members that are buried here. George and his wife, Sarah. George's parents, George's aunts and uncles. George's children are buried here. George Jr., he was 15 or 16, and he drowned in the Schuylkill River. There's another George Riddell. He was a Civil War soldier. He's pretty well known because he wrote letters home to his mom all about what it was like to be a soldier. He wrote about the living conditions, the food, the clothing, just the rough life that they had as soldiers. His mother, Eliza Riddell, kept those letters, and they were later published, and they're now at a museum. There's 3 sisters who died within a year and a half of each other, and none ever married. The first Riddell that came from Ireland was John Riddell, and he was a blacksmith. He died young. Most of the family members here died really young. It's sad, but I think it's pretty typical for that time, and I think a lot of the families buried here would have similar stories. They were immigrants, they didn't have medical care. They had the dreams. They definitely had the dreams.
To remember the dead is important. I think we need to remember who these people were, what role they played, how we can learn from those people. I think that it's a way of honoring the dead.
My Riddell ancestors, Sarah and George, their plot is about 8 feet by 10 feet, and there's no stone left. They were so poor that there's nothing left. I've come here to plant some bulbs, some daffodil bulbs that will come up in the spring every year as a reminder that there's life here and these folks are not forgotten.
Mount Moriah Cemetery, you know, I would think for people in the community who still know people who were buried there, it has to be a very heartbreaking experience to think about the fact that this is this place that's gone to weed, which is kind of interestingly symbolic about death. Widow's weeds. You put on widow's weeds when you mourn, and here are the ultimate physical widow's weeds.
My dad's grandfather was buried, but there was no marker from the federal government to put on the site. When I came back 2 weeks ago, I happened to notice that the area was totally covered with weeds and vines. I was so discouraged 2 weeks ago that I'd never be able to find it. Thomas Crozier, he was a corporal in the Civil War. I'm real happy that I found the site today. In section 51 is my mother's grandparents. I haven't seen that grave ever.
The cemetery was in pretty good shape. You know, you drove in, it was groomed, you could see all of the headstones that were there. Everything looked the way you would see a general cemetery looking.
My husband is buried here. It probably looked like it looks now, but when you're here on that kind of occasion, you know, you come in, it's all a blur anyway. So no, you didn't foresee that it would come to this.
But over time, you would notice that certain parts of the cemetery, it would become overgrown and take a little while for it to get taken care of. The last time I went there was when they said they had no idea who the owners were, or the owner had passed on and now who actually controlled it. So we haven't gone to try to visit it since we passed through and we saw it with the weeds overgrown and everything like that. Mount Moriah has a large number of Muslims buried there. Most of the funerals I've attended of Muslims have been at Mount Moriah. So this is why for the Muslim community in particular, in West Philadelphia and Southwest Philadelphia, the closing of Mount Moriah is a big thing for us because a number of our relatives are there. And one of the main tenets of our faith, or one of the things that we are enjoined to do, is to visit the graves often. You know, so you pray for the deceased and you remember death often. So that way you are reminded that this life is just, you're here just for a time.
We still feel a sense of the importance of honoring the past, of honoring these people who have gone, with the hope that someone someday will also honor our passage. The fact that we were here and that we made some kind of contribution, that our lives mattered to somebody, and that we did something so that our lives were significant.
I was one of the founders of the organization that was founded to help preserve and improve Mount Moriah, and that was the Friends of Mount Moriah.
The Friends of Mount Moriah Cemetery actually was started in the late 1990s by a group of people, family members who have people buried here, who saw that the cemetery was neglected and wanted to come in and try to help. The owners of the cemetery at that time were not receptive to their help and gave them a lot of pushback.
We discovered that a famous Civil War nurse, so a lady nurse, was buried there in an unmarked grave. And so we raised funds, we went to the cemetery and told them what we wanted to do, kind of to inform them, thinking that they would cooperate. And the first thing that they said to us when we went into the office, and this is very typical of this group, they said, so who is this woman? And we told her, when was she buried? 1864. Got the book out, looked up and said, you know, nobody's paid any money on that since 1864. You will have to pay up from 1864 before we'll allow you to place a stone. So it's like, what? What are you talking about? We're trying to do the right thing here. So eventually we paid 2 years of care in addition to funding the stone and then having a ceremony where we dedicated it with the press. They never came. The only thing, they put the stone in, they charged us, of course, and they never were involved.
Now what's happening is the Friends of Mount Moriah organization was formed to stem the tide of all the overgrowth and try to get the cemetery to be safe and accessible to the people that wanted to come here.
As it began to look better, people would donate more and become engaged because they weren't so intimidated about coming. And then with genealogy, people were excited about finding their ancestors. It doesn't matter if we ever do the whole cemetery, but doing some of it is better than doing a lot of talking about nothing.
Not only is it a historic landmark and people should preserve it and make it better than it is, but it also served a huge purpose for the neighborhood as an active burial ground.
It was a challenging place to come to see any sort of vision for what it could be or once was. But again, somebody's got to do it. It has to be done, so.
Cemeteries are a place where people can go and reflect on mortality. They can reflect on the people that have gone before them in their lives. It's a tremendously meditative space.
Everyone has a past, and everyone has a story to tell. Some people are alive and they can tell their stories, and some people are gone. And you just have to sift through the facts, and then you learn their story, and then you can tell their story for them.
Many of these people still have family that care about them, and they respect the memory, and they want to keep a tangible piece of evidence that that person existed.
There's no option to do nothing. People who are buried here, whether they lived a day, a minute, or 100 years, had a life. That life is to be honored and respected.
People have loved ones in here, and you need to show respect to them. Okay?